sometimes I think nothing is going to happen. That's a concern of mine. And in particular, I read large portions of Challenging the Secret Government by Catherine Olmsted. And she quotes Representative Michael Harrington, who articulated the belief that Congress's message to the intelligence agencies was consistent, both before and after the investigations. Engage in mischief, but do it discreetly. And I'll follow up a little bit. In your vocative interview, you said that you have a concern that the professional culture, quote unquote, culture of secrecy, corruption, cover up, obstruction, obfuscation at the NSA, and that's where you end your quote, will will ultimately produce outcomes that avoid real reform. So, what I'm saying is,
Yes.
I'm slowly answering my own question. I apologize. You have said it. You have actually said the answer, which is dismantling the NSA and rebuilding from the ground up.
Yes, I have.
So, do you continue to have that view?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so.
That's really ultimately because they're not going to give it up, and they'll kabuki dance as much as they can, and they've got a president who will protect them.
Right.
Oversight is a joke. Any attempt to improve it is, we've already seen the history. Remember, we did have what happened in the 70s that culminated in two standing permanent committees. We had never had permanent committees
Right. But
on
it is
intelligence to provide the oversight of the secret side of government. They've been completely co-opted,
sure.
with the exception of a few voices, in part because, why? Because of the risks, the extraordinary risks taken by truth tellers and whistleblowers to expose what's going on inside. You say the mischief, the problem is the mischief, right? Don't get caught. This mischief is being conducted on a vast scale,
Yes.
a scale the world has never seen before. Look, former Stasi officers have been interviewed. It said, it's naive to think that NSA and the U.S. government's not using this information for other purposes. They had the equivalent of a 24/7 surveillance society in East Germany. The problem was it wasn't persistent because, except where they had recorders, they wired as much of that nation as possible. They had people standing on street corners. They had they had an apparatus. But even the best of technology of the day could only do 40 simultaneous recordings. This is every nook and cranny of our lives. By virtue of the technology, I mean, the cynic in me is they simply are just riding us with the technology because they can. And the imperiousness, the hubris of that, the imperial hubris is who's going to stop us. And even when we're exposed, who's going to stop us? And we'll just kabuki dance it. Remember, the intel committees in FISA were all co-opted and compromised in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that was supposed to be the check.
Right.
Now, there is the third branch of government, right? And obviously the third branch of government was vital in the outcome of my own case. All I have to do is read the judge's words, extraordinary words that he said from the bench during my pro forma sentencing on July 15th of 2011. It says a lot. We don't do this to Americans. It's one reason we had an American Revolution. It's fundamental to who we are. I mean, the First and Fourth Amendment are at the foundation of how do you stay free from the predations and usurpations of the government and those who would want to take who you are away. Right. Because they can. Remember, people, you got to remember the psychology here. They get great pleasure doing this. They're compensating. You're compensating big time. They can't face their own citizenry, right? Mm-hmm. So they have to violate their rights in private. It's an extraordinary development in human history. And it's the dark side of who we are as human beings.
It is very scary.
But I'm not giving up. Remember, I wouldn't have done. People have asked, why did all this time? You weren't the one that made the decisions. What? I was a senior executive. I wasn't going to stand by and see orders issued that violated the fundamental oath that I took to support and defend. If the idea of governing ourselves with rights, and if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, those are inalienable rights, then they're worth fighting for. Because the quality of life given by a life with liberty and happiness, which are just among a set of inalienable rights, and that goes back to natural law. If you want to talk about real law, it's natural law, right? But that's a whole other conversation. If those aren't worth fighting for, then yeah, just give up and just let someone else control your life. I don't want to live a life.
No, certainly
I don't
not.
want to live a life like Winston, cowering in the corner. What the heck kind of life is that?
I completely agree with you, but and there is no but. I totally and utterly agree with you, and that's why this subject really provoked me in the last few months. I mean, starting in 2012, when there was a letter that Wyden and Udall wrote about shocking interpretations of law, and when I read that, I was shocked that they even used the term shocking. And then the Snowden disclosures, when I initially came out, I looked into it a little bit, and I was like, there was a cynicism in me that said, "Oh gosh, this is not. Of course, this is happening." But as I got more interested, did a lot more reading, I realized, it's very important. This is a bigger chapter. You see the torturing, the drones, and the Iraq War, and I feel awful saying this. I'm against all of it, and I see, they deserve complex analysis in each case. But this subject is really where, unlike those other subjects, which are awful and complicated, this is a situation where the American people are now the target. And that really shifted my thinking, And
remember, all empires collapse. All empires end up in the dustbin of history. The sands of time erase all empires. They're just mere pieces and fragments of history about what was, right?
Right.
And ultimately, empires collapse from within. And when they turn on their own citizens, as happened with the Roman Empire, all you have to do is, the whole Rubicon, crossing the Rubicon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you turn on your own, guess what? That's what's happened.
Oh, see.
Look, NSA here's an example. It's already been said publicly, but NSA knows far more about its own citizens than it does about Russia. The temptations to know everything there is, all this, oh no, we're not targeting you. Well, then why do you have all my information? Well, we don't have a personal dossier on you, but at the click of a button, we can create one. We had solved all this. See, part of what I live with, the burden I live with, we had solved this problem of how do you make sense of vast amounts of data, but how do you find the needles how do you find the shell in the sand that's buried that you can't see right away without disturbing the sand? We solved that problem.
Right. You're talking about thin. One second. You're talking about thin thread, right?
Yeah, that's one particular technology.
Okay.
But the government had a different idea. The government just keeps removing the sand from the beach.
I think about the following subject quite a bit, and others do as well. The notion of a real shift in global consciousness. Not just a shift that's a function of technology, but an actual moral shift. And I dare say spiritual, but I'll leave it at moral. A moral shift in people.
Look, we live on a planet, on a planet called Earth. It's on an outer arm of a Milky Way, which is just one of umpteen billions and billions of galaxies that we don't even know the extent of at least this universe. So, the perspective here is everything. So, yes, hope's not a strategy, by the way, okay? It just isn't. It was such a meme that Obama had hope and change, right? Hope for change or hope and change. It was all political anyways. I mean, but do I have, if I look forward? Yeah, I mean, I guess I could give you back a line from the movie Contact, right? Or a book that was written by Carl Sagan, turned into a Hollywood movie, right? Yeah, I do actually have that hope / faith of a better world. It's just we're living through a certain period of time here, right?
Yeah.
and human beings are an extraordinary reality, a manifestation, but we have our interesting contradictions, and we get to make choices, and those choices we make have consequences. Remember, the world is what you make it, and we choose to make that world. And so, if I want to choose a world that is controlled, and go back to the feudal days and moats and serfs and servants to the king, and the king ruling with manifest destiny, that's one way to live. And some would argue that's what's happening in the digital space. Okay, we don't actually have moats, and we don't have, but you do have the equivalent of that. That's not the life I want to live. So I choose to live a different life. I just happen to be within a system that had extraordinary power. And when they got, as my father would say, got too big for their britches, right, in terms of their authorities, and went overboard, they're now violating the fundamental compact with their own citizens.
Right.
Enough's enough. So I came out from the cold.
I was wondering if you want to speak to that at all. I mean, it has transformed our society, and I believe it. Ultimately, I believe it was, as I write in my blog, I say to some degree, I use language to not be quite as aggressive on the subject, but basically, I do think it was an inside job. I don't know how it unfolded. What do you think of this subject?
It's oversimplifying to say this inside job. All I have to do is read the history of Pearl Harbor, which I am intimately familiar with, having interviewed one of the last survivors at the radar site on the North Shore of Oahu, to know that it's way beyond just an inside job.
Sure.
Okay.
I call them mediated events, so to speak. It's you have enormous groups of people with differing objectives, and they culminate in a horrible event. And that's kind of how I see it. You can't just describe it as a group of people sitting in a room, a smoke-filled room, and saying this is going to happen on this day.
Although there are
those exist as well.
There still are those meetings. This is not one of them.
Right.
The fact is, 9/11 in many respects was a logical conclusion to all kinds of indications and warnings that had been ignored over many, many years. And I have deep, dirty knowledge on this. I sat on the terrorism desk as an intel officer in the Navy at the National Military Joint Intelligence Center, 18 months during the period in which Al-Qaeda and associated movements attempted to drop the World Trade Center towers the first time. And I remember then. So they're not giving up, they'll come back. I remember the general, the senior military intelligence officer who reports to the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, "Who cares about some raghead spouting off fatwas in the desert?"
Yeah.
They didn't get it. They did not get that these people were serious. Separate from how they got so ticked off, why did they want to punish not only their own countries but the Western world? Separate from the historical context that gave rise, to such a mindset, right? Separate from that, and you have to understand that there are causal factors in all this. The way we carved up the Middle East after World War I, for one.
No doubt.
But separate from all of that, that complicates the simplistic view of history. But you can't understand it without going there. So, 1998, Tenet said the system was blinking red. I'm telling you, 9/11 was easily preventable. We had the intelligence, even with the stuff that they hadn't discovered. Right, but I've got dirty knowledge on that, and I gave it to all these investigators as a whistleblower. And it was all suppressed and censored as if that history does not exist.
Right.
And the government even had tried to eliminate that as admissible or relevant for what would have been my trial. Now, the judge saw through that ploy. So, are there still questions about 9/11? Of course there are, but I'm just telling you that counterterrorism was a very low priority at NSA during the pre-9/11 era. It just wasn't a priority. Now, you could argue in terms of power, how do I sort of the Rahm Emanuel phrase, don't let a good crisis go to waste, even if you've manufactured it.
Right, right.
So obviously, the fundamental the truth was that the government failed to keep Americans and others out of harm's way. They failed in their fundamental responsibility under the preamble of the Constitution. That's truth.
Well, then I think
we can deconstruct
yeah.
all that took place as to what led to that. But I've gone over and I've met privately with some of the truer truthers who I know are sincere and who believe it truly is an inside job from the get-go. But you know what? They never account for the hijackers. They never account for the planning cells. And they continue to avoid the reality, the truth of airplanes actually hitting buildings. Okay? They actually avoid that.
Yeah. Well, it's a great experience to speak with you, and you really are a real hero. Yeah, I really mean that.
Not a hero. I'm going to say this to you. I'm going to keep telling people I understand why I'm called a hero.
Yeah.
Okay? I just did my job as an American who happened to take an oath to defend a way of life, and the way of life was a way to govern ourselves. That's the oath I took. I didn't take any other oath, all right? And I did so on behalf of millions of Americans who I feel I had a special obligation and burden to represent the best of America in the secret side of government.
I really hope that Congress does take the time to ask you for your testimony, and that you also potentially get this meeting with the president.
Well, we didn't get the meeting with the president. We were able to get our memo and the 21 recommendations into the hands of the White House counsel. We were able to get the same set of documents into the hands of any number of staffers who have direct access to those senators and representatives.